All right. Scott Hulm. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah, pretty close. It's Hulm. Well, that's how I
Hulm.
pronounce it anyway, but I think that could just be the Australian accent kicking in there. So, yeah, always a bit of a tricky one, but yeah, no, pretty close still.
Epic. Right on. Well, Scott Hulm, appreciate you taking the time to hop on the Informed Performance podcast. I'm really excited for the conversation today. I think it'll be a really fun one. Just kind of detailing around a whole bunch of different things around aponeurosis, muscle injury, all those fun things. So, before we get too deep into the weeds, you want to just
Mm.
give people a bit of a background on you if they haven't heard about what you are up to and what you do just yet.
Yeah. Well, currently I'm a part-time PhD candidate under the supervision of David Opar at the Australian Catholic Union, as well as part of the Sprint Research Centre. So I'm sort of just over halfway through that process at the moment. And generally that's looking at muscle tendon and myoponeurotic function and trying to use some computational modeling approaches to sort of try and answer a few of the questions that sort of remain unanswered. So that's sort of the academia and academic sort of side of my life. But I'm a senior rehab physio with the Western Bulldogs Football Club here in Australia. So that's an Australian Football League professional team. And yeah, primarily my role is obviously in that rehab space. So obviously I have a bit of a vested interest in muscle related and muscle tendon related injuries. So I think those both parts of my life sort of marry up quite nicely. Yeah.
Right on. And it's cool to hear just because I think a lot of times when you're very much an applied kind of applied practitioner, either certain aspects of research or just research as a whole can kind of have people stray away from things and almost just be like, well, I want to focus on the applied aspect, and research seems too far removed. Especially
Mm.
when you go into things like computational modeling and like really try and get into the weeds on that. What drew you into those sorts of areas, and what kind of need did you see there, especially coming from your applied background?
Yeah, I think it's a really great point, and to be honest, I was probably very much in that space myself for like a large portion of my career, sort of being very applied, certainly being I like to think across the literature, but probably not feeling like I was going to be taking sort of part of it, and it kind of just it grew from the more that you don't know. The more that you realize you don't know, and so this constant sort of search for answers sort of led to the process. Interestingly, during the COVID times, you sort of had more time on my hands to probably overthink things and start to really think about what else I can be sort of doing. I guess with my career, and also just in the sports physio and sports rehab space. And I really feel like the PhD focusing on those sort of deep computational approaches kind of adds a new skill set to what I do day to day. So I kind of see it like that more than anything else. That as this whole new skill set sort of feeds back in to the applied environment, and the more that I've worked in this space, and the more I'm learning, which is all the time, you start to sort of, I guess, draw those links a little bit more easily. And so yeah, like it's there's a lot of grey in what we do, and so trying to sort of feed that information into that grey and try and sort of create some outcomes for our athletes and our patients is critical.
Definitely. I appreciate that. It's always cool to hear
Mm,
why people decided to get started on a
mm,
multi-year undertaking project like a PhD. So
mm.
it's cool to hear. So when we think about these sorts of soft tissue injuries, I feel like a lot of times people will almost just clump them all together into something like an MTU based injury, right? Muscle tendon unit, right? For starters, can you maybe just break down the subcomponents of like the MTU from an anatomy
Yeah,
standpoint, and then we can just kind of take the conversation from there?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. I think when we look at often muscle strain or MT, muscle tendon unit type injuries, it sort of does get lost in this sort of MTJ and sort of a lot of this terminology that kind of just is become part of our vernacular. And so often as a result, that does have ramifications, I guess, in terms of how we've looked to study these over time. So when we define the MTU, we're really looking at obviously this free tendon, connecting obviously the muscle to bone, but also we have obviously our muscular tissue, which can break down through the scales, but effectively the linking sort of piece there between those is this aponeurotic structures. And generally, this is described kind of like a large sort of connective tissue sheet, but in reality, and across different muscles and different MTUs, it can be far more specific to that muscle. And so, for instance, the biceps femoris has this almost cylindrical, tendon-like, cord-like proximal aponeurosis that obviously penetrates into the muscle. So it provides almost this scaffold, both potentially distally or proximally, using biceps as our analogy or our example, to sort of connect our muscle tissue to the free tendon. And that's also then complicated a little further with the interaction between the extracellular matrix and that aponeurotic tissue. And so where obviously these muscle fascicles are attaching onto our aponeurotic tissue, we are also having these connections through via the epimysial tissue and the perimysial tissue. So there's some sort of really fantastic diagrams within the literature, which potentially we can link onto the episode, but that sort of demonstrate that probably better than I can speak to it. But I think that really just demonstrates, I guess, that intricate, more complex nature of the MTU versus that sort of muscle tendon, a more simplistic model. And obviously, as I alluded to, that sort of has implications for the types of injuries that we see along these sites. Yeah,
Definitely. I think some other terms that are kind of thrown around are things like, intramuscular tendon, right? And even, fascia and like those sorts of things. Are there differences between these structures and what we're calling aponeurosis, or are they largely similar?
I think they're largely similar. It is very much a terminology piece in terms of, exactly, either where we've often studied or where we're getting our information from. Sort of across the literature, we do see this, very, very, terminology for the aponeurosis tissue in terms of what I've seen. So, you're right. We see these sort of intratendinous, intramuscular tendon, intramuscular rachis, fascia, for lack of another word. But I think, sometimes that is sort of more interconnected with some of the extracellular matrix conversation. So diving into the literature a little bit more, you can start to sort of ascertain that they are largely the same structures. Now, I can certainly understand how the intramuscular tendon for biceps femoris is used, because it does have this very cord-like, tendon-like structure. Now, what we do understand is that the aponeurosis and tendon tissue does behave differently when we talk about it as a free tendon to these broad connective tissue sheets of the aponeurosis. But potentially, and it's unclear really, is that intramuscular tendon, which I'm sort of describing as this intramuscular aponeurosis, does that differ dramatically from the free tendon? I would largely suggest that it must do, considering the amount of muscle tissue attachment that it has, and almost on this multi-axial sort of plane. So that's why I tend to look to define them differently. But I understand within the literature how that comes to be. But I think just acknowledging acknowledging the differences, but also how these structures can be described similarly. Yeah,
Definitely. I always just feel like sometimes, especially in my earlier times reading through research, there were different terminologies and different ways of describing, and I was like, it sounds like these things are similar, but I can't tell because there's different names. And so it's nice to just kind of level the playing field a little bit for people.
Yeah. Yep.
So when it comes to understanding this kind of difference that you've referenced when it comes to the free tendon versus, the aponeurosis. You mentioned, these structures kind of have the potential to behave differently just based on the loads that are placed on them, the types of loading, the directions, all those sorts of things. Can you unpack maybe the reason why these structures may or may not behave differently, and kind of just give the listeners a bit of an explanation as to why the function of these kind of structures is slightly different?
Yeah. Largely, I think the free tendon deforms, I guess, more uniaxially, I guess, in that longitudinal direction. I guess it kind of, as alluded to, transmit those forces generated by the muscle to the bone, kind of in this really, more simplistic sort of line of pull along the axis of the MTU, where the aponeurosis has this sort of multi-axial deformation, and that's largely due to the muscle attachments to the bulging muscle tissue, the increase in intramuscular pressure within the muscle sort of has this stretch in this, it's described in a number of animal studies and within human studies as well, particularly around the calf, that we have this increase in transverse stretch. And that's sort of identified, again, to accommodate the muscle tissue. So it's largely, whilst they're sort of probably primarily comprised of similar collagen makeup, these longitudinal collagen fibrils, we do still see maybe there's this more superficial branching or oblique or transverse fibers that may actually allow that aponeurotic tissue to deform in that manner, multiaxially. Now, the challenge is this similar from muscle to muscle? What we currently know is that it probably fits like this quite similarly across the calf muscle structures and across the calf aponeurotic structures, because that's probably where the most of the information sort of been sort of derived from, along with obviously animal studies in that space as well. So, yeah, the question is, does that it operate similarly in the hamstring muscle aponeurotic structures, particularly these cord-like structures, where maybe I could sell the point that distal aponeurosis of biceps fem does have that, because it does appear more sheet-like. It potentially has more of a similar extramuscular orientation as like a surface point for those muscle attachment versus that intramuscular component. But effectively, yeah, it's the muscle. The aponeurosis has like it does have this sort of elastic, viscoelastic element in that longitudinal direction, like the free tendon. So they sort of act together to transmit force, but it obviously has this more unique, multi-axial deformation pattern as well, and that's to accommodate the muscle tissue.
That's great. And I think like when I hear those areas, when we're thinking, multi-axial deformation or these sorts of things, where my head goes is like, okay, cool. What's contributing to that? And most likely it's, the muscle tissue itself, different angles from pronation angles from different areas from muscles. Like they're going to be yanking on these structures in different, more or less from a different angle with different intensities, with different loads. Are you familiar with any, information, evidence, theories, whatever it may be out there on the influence that, a pronation angle could have when it comes to this structure? Like where my head goes is almost like a shallower pronation angle. You may then be able to see, hey, maybe a little bit more of that kind of uniform tensile type of loading. Whereas like as that muscle gets bulkier and that pronation angle changes, you may see maybe less efficient transmission or anything along those lines.
Yeah, I think this is sort of along some of the lines of the muscle gearing stuff that I'm sort of probably not as well versed in, but sort of my understanding, obviously, that we will see this change in almost the aponeurotic sort of shape in line with these changes of loading. So therefore, an increase in pronation angle. But I think one big factor that sort of I take with that is, if I come back to the aponeurosis, it's almost how its own properties, its material properties may help, withstand, I guess, or ability to sustain or the bulging muscle tissue. So what we do see is that its transverse modulus is greater than the free tendon, so it has this ability to stretch further, and that's sort of been well described with some cadaveric data. The other factor is there's clear regional stiffnesses and regional differences along its length, where we see this like non-uniform strain, where aspects of the aponeurosis will lengthen while other aspects will shorten. And I think that sort of comes into what you're suggesting around how does it actually accommodate the attachment points and these changing pronation angle. Again, that's been work in some phase contrast MRI. I think you can take some of the work from it and sort of apply it, but yeah, there's still probably a lot more sort of work to be done, and potentially, as I sort of alluded to, maybe some of the computational modeling approaches does give us a little bit more information around there. I think there's one paper that comes to mind around the Soleus three-dimensional model, where they do change vary the stiffness, both the magnitude in both, obviously great, making it more stiff and therefore also less stiff or more compliant, and that both increase fascicle strain. So we do see just altering the actual properties, either these mechanical properties, obviously understanding the material properties, those intrinsic material properties for that specific muscle will also influence these muscle shape changes, and no doubt, obviously, the specific muscle architecture, a VL versus a biceps femoris in terms of its pronation angle and fascicle length, and its overall muscle volume is going to influence that differently as well. So I think just sort of having an understanding across all those kind of 3 points will give you a better understanding of why you're seeing that aponeurosis deform or behave the way it does.
That's great. When we look at, understanding, how the aponeurosis behaves the way it does, when we think about that kind of function, we inherently then kind of go down the road of, okay, well, when that function is therefore limited with injury or structural change or things like that, what do we do? What characteristics are there, or what differentiators exist when we think about an aponeurosis injury versus just a typical like muscle injury?
Mm. It's a really good point. And the classification systems around this are particularly, I think, certainly way more advanced than when I started as a sports physio. I think like having the BAMIC classification system and understanding sort of the amount of sort of tendon or aponeurosis involvement from a cross-sectional area and how they obviously classify accordingly with that has allowed us to sort of understand the injuries more. Other classification systems sort of specific to gastroc in terms of understanding the different types along this free gastroc aponeurosis, or is it this extramuscular type aponeurosis that I was alluding to? And obviously I think there's even Carlos Pedres' work in terms of this more histoarchitecturally sort of driven classification model, where it's like this myoconnective tissue continuum. It's like, where along that continuum is it? Is it aponeurosis? Is it free tendon? Is it just sort of muscle tissue or myofascial type injury? My kind of sort of answer is like, how do I differentiate? Is that mostly what I see is that they all involve some element of connective tissue, because when we're seeing a level of injury, it is either at this myofascial sort of level. So it's along, when we're seeing some fascicle attachment into that epimysial border. Are we seeing it on, at the actual injury site, at the aponeurotic sort of myoponeurotic junction? So we're seeing almost like a straight disruption of those ends of the muscles away with minimal impact or, disruption to the aponeurotic tissue. But then we're seeing others with significant aponeurotic injury and sort of cross-sectional area involvement, which might look like a transverse, like straight sort of almost cleft. Or we see these sort of longitudinal, so almost like a splitting of the aponeurotic tissue. And we see that sort of in those proximal aponeurotic sort of sections of biceps femoris longhead. And coming back to sort of that disruption of the muscle fascicles from the epimysium. We sort of see that at those distal aponeurosis of biceps fem, where we're seeing short head and long head attaching, and sort of that nasty T junction injury, which is just sort of described within the literature. We're sort of seeing more commonly as well. So as you can see, we're seeing a lot of different sort of types of injuries, but they all involve some sort of this myoconnective continuum. And that's kind of how I see them. In terms of sort of then the severity, I think you can see if there's sort of a greater lesion to that aponeurotic tissue, I'm starting to be, potentially more conservative in my sort of early approach and also my return to play planning. Now, the literature sort of suggests that those larger ones take longer and they're potentially more likely to re-injure. But a lot of those studies are also not blinded to the clinicians. So that I see a larger injury, does that influence my behavior around how long I create my planning? And so there's some other work that suggests that doesn't influence the outcome. So I think just getting a balance of the athlete in front of you. I mean, my experience is that we do need to respect the level and significance of the lesion. And when we don't, they tend to be the ones that do recur. So I tend to sort of respect the tissue, but also use my clinical skill sets and see how that athlete is progressing accordingly. I think it's a bit of still a little bit of a grey area, that one. That's is sort of no perfect sort of science there. But I think if you speak to probably a number of clinicians, it would be kind of a similar approach and probably a similar experiences, I believe.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more. It's one of those things where, you can see whether it's conflicting evidence or evidence that just doesn't give you a sound answer to like hang your hat on. It just makes things a little bit more difficult when it says like, okay, we have a higher grade, muscle tendon unit injury. What do we do now? And so that's always kind of the question at hand. And I guess if we fast forward along that timeline and let's say we give that individual a little bit extra time, they have a little bit more time when it comes to recovery and healing. But now we know, hey, there was still a significant setback and significant disruption within the aponeurosis itself. Where does your head go when it comes to the aponeurosis and its ability to respond to load, its ability to adapt? Are there any specific considerations that you need to make when we're thinking about creating adaptation within these structures?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And I think we have a review hopefully coming out soon that sort of at that time we sort of discussed that there is sort of very little information regarding how the aponeurosis does adapt to mechanical load. What we did sort of understand is that most of the work had been done in sort of this deep vastus lateralis aponeurosis, and largely what we saw is that prolonged duration, upwards towards 15 weeks with pretty high intensity or progressive intensity of their training, specific to obviously the knee extensors, did show pretty significant changes. I think they saw sort of maybe even 8 to 9% changes in cross-sectional area off the top of my head. But more recently, we've actually seen a little bit more around the hamstring musculature. Sort of 2 papers sort of came out pretty recently and in close proximity to one another. And one sort of paper didn't really identify big aponeurotic changes in terms of size, which is in itself a bit of a different. We can talk about that potentially on its own, and they looked at sort of aponeurotic volume, and I think they also looked at aponeurotic like interface area, and they didn't find a lot. And they used to sort of I think it was a 10-week hip extension Nordic hamstring curl intervention, but they did show pretty significant muscle volume and cross-sectional area adaptations. So that was interesting. Then the other paper sort of had this seated, almost eccentric focus seated leg curl. And those really long MTU lengths, with this eccentric focused approach, did show some pretty notable changes, and that was comparatively to the Nordic hamstring curl. This paper, again, 12 weeks, I think, so a little bit longer duration. Off the top of my head, I can't sort of ascertain the intensity of those of what they, but I understand. I think it was progressive intensity across the 12-week period, and so we can see that this proximal aponeurosis can adapt. Potentially, my takeaway there is long MTU lengths, an eccentric contraction-based focus, and we are able to sort of also achieve sort of some pretty significant muscle size adaptations as well. The challenge is what do we define as aponeurotic size? Like across the literature, we talk about maximum width as something that's interesting, or width in general is interesting. I think other computational models identified narrow widths obviously increase the long fiber strain at that myoponeurotic junction. So, and then some retrospective work identified that maximal, those with previous history have a smaller maximal width of that proximal aponeurosis. So, is that important to have some adaptation? I think that muscle to aponeurotic, either volume ratio or width ratios have also identified, potentially increasing, long fiber strain, and also been identified in athletes with a prior injury. Now, again, retrospective studies, you can't really sort of make a lot of causal comments there, but we can sort of start to build out, well, what are the types of measurements that we actually think are important, and what's the effect that from an injury prevention and maybe even from an adaptation point of view? Like, what do we actually want to achieve with our training? Now, I think the other big factor here is we want to restore the tissue quality. I think from an injury point of view, or restore its continuity, maybe is a better way to describe it. We're seeing this lesion. We want to have, this continuity returned. And I think there's some good MRI sort of work to suggest that potentially is important in terms of return to play and minimizing, re-injury risk. Again, there's other studies that sort of refute that. But sort of my approach then is to try and find strategies to load the tendon where I am seeing adaptation and a restoration of the continuity of the tendon. You can use MRI to help sort of guide us there. And then the other big factor then is what do we know influences, I guess, the stiffness of and returning that immature collagen to a more mature collagen, and then sort of restoring this optimal stiffness. Now, I've kind of alluded that I think some other sort of clinicians suggest that like too stiff, and high muscle forces sort of don't marry up very, very nice. But this idea of like what do we define as this optimal stiffness to that muscle attachment is really challenging at the moment, and I don't think we have a very good answer. But if I kind of to put all that kind of together, Dylan, and this is why it's a challenging one, is that I think my approach generally is sort of protect kind of that region of lesion early, load the structure sort of in these more shorter MTU lengths, so I'm not putting great strain on it, progressively increase MTU length, and that can be through a variety of ways. We still like to use the Nordic. We might play with some strategies around hip flexion. We'll use a 45-degree Roman chair. Again, that showed really good muscle adaptation. So that muscle to aponeurotic volume ratio, it might be something that we really strive for. And then even this idea of using potentially strategies or tasks that have this potential to have a bias to the passive tissue. Now, that's some early work that potentially like an RDL type task, which has a very kind of silent EMG, period through that eccentric phase actually may be, producing a lot of the force through that phase through its passive tissues. So potentially is that a strategy that I tend to use maybe in that mid to late stage? So I am trying to really address these connective tissues. It's kind of, I don't think there's a recipe, and clearly for different muscle and different MTUs, you're going to have a very different approach because of their intricate and different aponeurotic structures. But I think that hopefully gives a bit of a snapshot of kind of where the literature sits at the moment, but it by no means, I think, clear in terms of this is the criteria that you should be addressing. I think it's a bit of like, have a bit of a good understanding of across the literature that you want to be able to, I guess, influence some of those outcomes that we know potentially do have an adaptive effect.
It's cool to hear, because even at a scenario when we're in such a new phase of like understanding this tissue and how it adapts and all these sorts of things, certain themes consistently come about when it comes to, just principles of injury management and muscle injury management as a whole, right? The length tension relationship of a muscle is, always going to be relevant, and making sure that we can understand how that plays into a rehab is super important. I guess
Absolutely.
Adding on to that or compounding with that, one thing that I'm always curious about is, I guess the contraction type itself within a muscle and how it may potentially play a role within this kind of a rehab. When you're thinking concentrics, isos, eccentrics, is there anything that like jumps out to you saying like, hey, I want to hit this early or hit this late, or be wary of these sorts of types of loads because of X, Y, and Z? Where does your head go to with this, especially when it comes to aponeurosis injuries?
Yeah, it's a really, another really, a really great question. I think I kind of try and lean on a little bit of the tendon research here, where it doesn't seem like maybe contraction mode is hugely important. When I say that is that they may not differ dramatically. I think when you look at across a lot of the tendon adaptation literature, when we're looking at stiffness, cross-sectional area, modulus, I think eccentric training does sort of have that little bit of a edge potentially on the concentric isometric in terms of adaptations. But when you sort of put them all together, I think they're much of a muchness. But what we know is that we are looking for really high strain. So I think the works are sort of around that sort of 5% and maybe more. But then how do we sort of measure that in a clinic situation is really hard. So I think, I tend to think of it as that sort of greater than 85, 90%, 1RM. So, which, is pretty high intensity, training for different tasks. So it's like, you've got to do a sort of fair bit of work around sort of navigating how you even intervene with sort of that level of intensity. But sort of my takeaway from the aponeurotic tissue is that we also have to take into consideration that have this really unique, obviously, muscle connective tissue interaction. Now, across some of the literature now, we sort of see this decoupling effect, right? Like we see a Nordic hamstring curl where the fascicles almost act isometrically for a large portion of the task, except for maybe the last sort of 10, 20%. So the MTU is actually taking up most of that lengthening. And so I think that's my approach. If I want high strain, high intensity, I think having an eccentric focused approach, especially in that mid to late stage, to have the adaptations of the connective tissue that I want, that I also want to maintain some really significant fascicle sort of length in terms of, we know that's a significant, a modifiable risk factor for hamstring strain injuries, if we're using that sort of as the example in this case. So I know that I'm having that effect using an eccentric stimulus and a pretty, hopefully high intensity one. So my gut feels that I get to sort of buffer the muscle tissue by having these really sort of high eccentric approaches to the tendon and the connective tissue, so including the aponeurosis. but then I'm also potentially having the muscle architectural changes that I'm looking for as well. So that's generally my approach. Early on, as I alluded to, I sort of do have this sort of just a protective sort of element of limiting a little bit of that strain. It makes sense to me, especially if I'm having like a longitudinal lesion or a pretty significant transverse. I don't want to just be applying more and more strain to that. So I do sort of, look to have potentially a little bit more of a slow, controlled, conventional loading. So that might look like a hammy curl. It might look like a Roman chair, but through a limited range of motion, or a 45-degree hip extension. And then I just progressively increase MTU length and obviously the intensity of that task through, and then potentially overlay that with a bit more of an eccentric focus. So that's generally sort of the approach. They're sort of looking to sort of achieve the adaptations that we sort of touched on a little bit before. I think we're going to have those. We're going to have that sort of balance of the stiffness and the ability to restore some of that stiffness and continuity of the aponeurosis, but also potentially having those muscle architectural changes that we know are potentially protective.
So a lot of this kind of conversation is revolved around, specifically we think about hamstrings when it comes to a lot of these sorts of adaptations and those sorts of things. Just obviously work within the Sprint research group, and they're doing a whole lot of awesome stuff around these types of injuries. I always selfishly bring things back to the calf because it's what I'm interested in. But when you think about something like Soleus, where there's multiple compartments and those sorts of things and all those different structures, I would assume that inherently adding more different aponeuroses within a single muscle is going to increase in complexity. But are there any influences that you're aware of that having, more than one aponeurosis within a specific muscle is going to influence either something like injury risk, something like exercise selection, something along those lines? Anything clinically important that you could see when we're thinking about multiple aponeuroses within a muscle?
Yeah, I think probably not at this stage, certainly not to influence injury risk, but potentially an exercise selection. I think that's reasonable to suggest. For instance, Soleus, obviously with its multi-compartments, we have this sort of anterior and posterior aponeurosis. We also have that sort of the median septum that kind of protrudes through, like almost interdigitates across the compartments. So I think, again, taking into consideration which aponeurotic tissue is, potentially we're seeing the lesion within, may influence obviously your exercise selection in terms of, where within that Soleus is the lesion. Is it at that median septum? Therefore, are we looking to potentially have a little bit more of a protective phase because of the amount of muscle and sort of multi-axial attachment points we have to that? Potentially, we are limiting too much MTU length early. Obviously, we're also seeing different strains for the posterior and anterior aponeurosis dependent on level of dorsiflexion. So, are you getting a bit creative in terms of, are we loading some inner range sort of work? Are we loading, or are we really starting to focus into some sort of long MTU lengths to sort of address those structures? I think you can get a little cute there. I think in the end, if we use good loading principles, again, I tend to with Soleus look to have a process of, again, have a little bit of a protective lengthening phase, protective range of motion phase, and then really challenge them, in that mid to late stage to get them into dorsiflexion. Bearing in mind that I work with, field-based running athletes, so and with high degrees of acceleration, deceleration demand. So having sort of them into those, very provocative positions, it makes sense to train them into those strategies. So it's definitely take them into consideration. It's just, again, it comes back to like how much, and calves are really interesting. We don't really know. Again, we don't even have, I think, much to go on from an adaptation in terms of, a morphological or a lot specific to the aponeurosis in terms of its mechanical properties. So I think there's still a little bit more to be sort of done in that space to help us guide in terms of exercise selection. So it'd be interesting to look at some contraction, mode approaches. And even with the hamstring, that comes back, like a lot of the studies that I sort of alluded to primarily were eccentric, based. It was like, it's interesting. It would be interesting to know what is the effect of a very concentric based approach specifically to the aponeurosis adaptation. Now, that might not be that useful for hamstring for its fascicle leg adaptations, but calf, maybe slow, controlled approaches. Maybe there's something more to be had there. Maybe it's not potentially as critical, but it's I think up for debate. My approach there is slow, controlled loading through load with probably an eccentric focus and progressive MTU length. So it's probably not a huge change of tack. Yeah.
Gotcha. And then expanding things out, are there any other areas or body regions that we haven't talked about today? But I'm pretty much all I can recall is calf and hamstring. But are there any other areas within the lower extremity or upper extremity that we know a little bit more about, or there's other things to just kind of touch on when we're thinking about aponeurosis?
Yeah, I think, look, rectus femoris is obviously another pretty significant. It's obviously pretty prevalently involved, especially in running and kicking sports, as an area of injury, and particularly that central aponeurosis and posterior aponeurosis. There's some really unique injuries there. There's the degloving type injury where we almost see a plugging, almost like a finger out of like finger in a glove type mechanism where we're pulling the finger or that central tendon out of its inner muscle belly. The rec fem has this fascinating sort of inner and outer muscle belly sort of structure. And so from the indirect tendon, we see this central aponeurosis sort of penetrate, and at times with these high strain mechanisms, potentially kicking and high velocity sprinting, we do see a bit of a plug there. So my always interest is that a mycial kind of tissue injury at the base of that aponeurosis, especially if there's no significant lesion within the aponeurotic tissue itself. But they can take a little while to recover because you want to have that sort of that tendon or aponeurosis almost stuck back down is sort of my approach there. And you can kind of have a similar theory with that T-junction is if you're not having good connection there and we're just loading that structure and they're not sort of having that epimysial to sort of fascicle sort of connection intact, we kind of, I think you can get through a fair bit of like slow loading, even slow velocity running, but at that top end, they tend to fail. And so I think just, again, respecting kind of that tissue healing approach early is kind of important. And I think of the posterior aponeurosis of rec fem kind of similarly to the medial gap structs in terms of how the layers of the structure with vastus intermedius and rec fem. So I always picture the image from the paper from Padre with medial gastrocs and kind of use that as my sort of mental picture in terms of how I understand sort of that lesion at that site, and they're relatively prevalent as well. So I think that's pretty notable, and clearly adductor muscles are another obviously site. Again, probably not as prevalent, particularly in the sports that I've worked with, but potentially in a lot more, potentially ice hockey would be interesting. I'm unclear if the prevalence there is greater, but that again, adductor longus and brevis have a sort of pretty unique interaction proximally, but we also see an intramuscular tendon with longus, so no doubt injuries along that site. Again, often referred as an MTJ injury. They recover quite well when you manage them. I wonder, how does that differ from the other muscles we've spoken about, even from a loading and adaptation point of view? But potentially similarly, I think. So, I think clearly my bias is to the lower body. I think the upper body I'll leave to sort of the experts in that space. But yeah, no doubt there's significant aponeurotic structures there as well, and injuries to the pec structures, in contact sports like Australian rules football. Yeah, certainly probably take into consideration. We obviously see some pretty significant sort of free tendon injury there as well. So yeah, I think our approach though is probably pretty similar.
That's great. Now, I guess Scott, we'll bring things a little bit to a close here. Let's say this is the first circumstance where somebody's listening and this is the first exposure to anything aponeurosis related when they're thinking about what they would have previously thought of as just a typical muscle strain or anything like that.
Yep.
Can you give them maybe a couple key points or key takeaways in terms of maybe similarities and differences, what you do or what you've learned, what you would do differently, anything along those lines associated with just good take-home points along aponeurosis injury?
I think the big takeaway is have a really good understanding of that MTU structure and the interactions between the free tendon, the aponeurosis, and the muscle structure. I think, again, coming back to that understanding of the interaction, I think then gives you a much better understanding of what you're seeing when you are presented with a myoponeurotic or muscle tendon injury in your clinic, with your athletes. So I think just having that really good understanding of, how the extracellular matrix is interacted with the aponeurosis, how our muscle fiber and fascicle sort of structures are involved with that, and sort of that linking structures between the free tendon and the aponeurosis, which then probably leads to the second point, is probably understanding that the aponeurosis and tendon do behave differently. And so just having a sort of a basic understanding of that sort of does just give you a little bit more of a, to reflect on, I guess, your approach to these types of injuries. They're not free tendons. So I think I've seen a little bit where we just kind of throw just purely the tendon, like isometric protocol kind of at them. And I'm not sure that's just is going to be the way forward. Now, it's not to suggest that you can't use isometrics. It's just to suggest that maybe that's not the only strategy you're going to address tendon-related injuries. And in this case, the aponeurosis may behave differently, and you may need to really consider, that muscle connection and that interaction, I guess, between them. And then kind of my approach is, whilst there's a lot of grey, use what we have available to us from the literature point of view, but also use the clinical skill sets that we have. Test well. Use tests that are really meaningful. Either through the literature, what you've found clinically. Again, measure kind of what matters and track that through. That will give you a lot of that will limit a lot of the issues that occur with these types of injuries late. If you show a progressive loading scheme and you're showing progressive improvements in strength, in muscle architecture, in the continuity of that aponeurosis, we're restoring length, we're restoring on-field demands, and the athlete is, tolerating these strategies, then you're largely going to have a pretty successful approach. I think when things start to not look right, I can't seem to get, this person just won't get stronger. There's something to me, they can't produce force on this particular task. If we use a Nordic or any other sort of load cell, isokinetic dynamometry, force plate, if we're doing some plantar flexor strength testing, why is this athlete not adapting? Then I think that's where having that initial information and understanding of all these structures and potentially the tissue, respecting that tissue healing element, will influence your processes, pretty significantly.
Scott, thank you so much, man. This is awesome. I think you gave the listeners plenty to take away and plenty to think about more, especially if they've got any cases currently when it comes to muscle or aponeurosis type injury. So if they wanted to follow up or get in contact with you in some other way, how and what would be the best way to do it? How can they follow you and all the awesome work that you're doing? Fill them in there.
Yeah, probably LinkedIn's probably as good as any place now. I am on Twitter. I don't particularly post a lot. No doubt. Hopefully, I have some more work coming through soon. So hopefully we can push that out through LinkedIn and Twitter. But always happy to take an email as well. So yeah, happy to yeah provide those for you, Dylan, as well, for the listeners. But yeah, they're probably the best places to catch me.
Epic. Well, Scott, thanks again, man. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll catch up again soon.
Sounds great. Thanks, Dylan. Really appreciate it.